Should we start? All right. So welcome everybody. So as the slides suggest, our talk is about cyber hacks and computer law. And we're going to try to make this a little bit different than other legal discussions. We're going to try to make this interesting instead of, here's the law, here's what you didn't know. But what we're going to talk about is mainly around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So when we're talking about physical kinetic attacks, which are cybersecurity attacks with physical ramifications, I'm sure the entire conference is devoted to other technical aspects around that. What we're going to talk about is what legal ramifications there are when we're talking about cyber physical attacks when you're on both sides. One, if you're on the corporate side or the government side and you're trying to prevent certain attacks like that, and then the other when you are a hacker or a security researcher and sometimes you get strung up in the current laws that are out there. So with me today, Mr. Tor Ekeland, who, unlike me, is a real attorney because he actually represents people in court. I don't. I'm a regional privacy officer and counsel for ADP, responsible for all of the Americas. So I'm here giving advice around privacy and security across our business units. Tor is actually representing some security researchers and hackers in court and vice versa. And luckily, we also have with us Mr. Terry Sult, the Chief of Police for the City of Hampton, that can actually allow us to see what he's seeing on a day-to-day basis when it comes to cybersecurity attacks and the physical ramifications. So what is our agenda today? Briefly, we're going to talk about what is a cyberkinetic attack, a brief history of moving straight into the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and why is it so crucial when we're talking about cybersecurity attacks, and why is it so important for security researchers, corporations, and the government to really get a handle on how that law operates, and then what exceptions are being made and how that law is changing today. Because it is such a broad law, there's so much prosecutorial discretion that what are some things that are happening pro and con to narrow that law and expand that law at the same time, and what are some states doing at the same time to make the issues around that law also applicable to what they do as well. What are some other laws in place that have ramifications for security researchers, for corporations trying to protect their information, for active defense measures? Now, does everybody in the room know what active defense is? Does anybody not know what it is? Okay, so we don't have to go into the definition, but we'll talk about whether that's good or bad, right? And what are some of the pros and cons around active defense and some of the legal issues that are coming out of certain bills that are pending that talk about active defense. And then we're going to talk about also when it comes to the Internet of Things space or the AI space, what are some of the same laws and different laws that may apply as to how we're actually building out those software systems, and then minimize liability risk if we have time, and then a Q&A. Now, before I turn it over to Tor and Terry, we're going to start talking about what is a cyberkinetic attack. The way we'd like to structure this is we have about 10 minutes at the end. We only have 30 minutes today. We have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. But if we just want to ask questions throughout the whole 30 minutes, we're fine with that. So if people have questions, raise your hand. We'll start right into the Q&A. If not, then Tor and Terry, would you like to go ahead and start?
Sure, I'll just start with today. So why don't I just start real quick on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which probably most of the people in this might want to go here. So why don't I just start real quick with giving a brief summary of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which I think probably if you're in this room, you've heard of. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is the federal government's primary tool for prosecuting computer crimes, AKA hackers. It originates in 1984. Sometimes you'll hear people say 1986. That's when they formalized the name, but it really has its origins in 1984. And it comes about in a time when hackers first really come to the fore in public consciousness. You may be aware of the movie War Games. That's a 1983 movie where Matthew Broderick plays a character that hacks into NORAD and almost starts a nuclear war. There was also a set of hackers at the time. I think they were called the 411s, based on an area code, and they hacked into Sloan Kettering's hospital's billing system. And when they got into the billing system, they raised these concerns that they might kill patients. So one of the primary concerns that motivated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act actually is sort of a fear of a cyberkinetic attack. And you can actually see it. If you read it, you'll see a lot of provisions in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that up the penalties for if you cause death or serious injury or you hack a government computer and whatnot. But I'm not going to go into a lengthy discussion because we could be here all day talking about it. But the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act does two primary things. It prohibits unauthorized access to a protected computer, And of course, there's a huge debate over what unauthorized access means. The courts all over the country are split on that. And it also prohibits unauthorized damage to a protected computer. And by the way, protected computers is basically almost anything with a microprocessor. You're never going to win a case trying to argue something is not a protected computer. I've tried it. But unauthorized damage is also a really poorly defined term. It has a specific definition in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is basically any impairment, whatever that means, to the integrity, whatever that means, or availability of the data. So a lot of courts read it to mean deleting data. A lot of courts interpret it to that a DDoS attack constitutes damage. So those are the two primary things the CFAA prohibits. Is there any questions on that? All right, then we've talked about what a cyberkinetic attack is. I think everybody gets it. And what's happening now, I think what everyone's well aware of, is as the Internet of Things comes online, everyone in this room has got a computer in their pocket with more computing power than a supercomputer had in the 80s. You've got computerized thermostats, door controls, windows. Everything's becoming automated with computers in it. And nobody's really thinking about the security of those devices. The number one thing I see in the cases that I work on involving hackers is really, really bad information security on the part of corporations. And I've come around to the opinion that the number one problem with information security and the Internet of Things is not technical, because you can get a good technician, they just cost a lot of money, right? It's behavioral. And it's behavioral in the sense that people don't pay enough attention to the behavioral psychology of the people working for them. They get lazy, they think that code is going to solve their problems. They don't spend the money up front. And then what I see in my cases is there's this tendency to sort of romanticize the hacker as this evil actor to save face. Because frankly, if attention was focused on how bad these companies' information security was, people would be losing their jobs and they would be embarrassed. So what they do is they take the criminal law, in my opinion, and they use it to demonize this hacker, who's usually some teenage kid or whatever, who's done something stupid, mind you, but as some sort of evil person. But I could go on about that for hours.
Now, the interesting thing, I will, as Tor is talking, I mean, it's amazing to hear, at least for me, his viewpoint, because certainly with my employer, I don't have that view, right? And here's a disclaimer, my own views in this, right, doesn't represent the views of ADP. But I'm curious, Chief, like, have you seen cyberkinetic attacks actually happening in your role right now? And because I'm sure a lot of people say, well, we don't really see it yet, but I'm sure that you do. Is that correct?
Yeah, we absolutely are seeing attacks, and not just, there's two different areas of attacks that we would see things. One is in the private sector and in the community with the citizens and that sort of thing, whether it's on a personal level where personal identity is stolen or whether it's a corporate theft. And then there's also the internal aspect of it, of the data that we use in our systems. And we are seeing a lot of attacks anytime that there's any kind of social unrest or a particularly, say, an officer-involved shooting is very questionable, it becomes controversial, then you can pretty much expect that that agency is going to be subject of an attack, and even the leaders of that agency or the city are going to be attacked. And that's been proven true many, many times. We have seen cities held for ransom. Atlanta is a prime example of that. When we start
we'll talk about why.
Yeah,
right?
we'll talk about why here.
Georgia stuff happening now, right?
But there are two different levels that we are seeing, and you were mentioning the private sector. A lot of times we won't see things on the larger level because the private companies don't want to damage their reputations, and so they're not reporting to law enforcement. When you talk about local law enforcement versus federal law enforcement, there are thresholds. And if you cross a certain threshold, you're going to draw the attention of the federal authorities, or if you do something that's a acute political emergency, we can call in a favor and we can get the assistance on the federal level. But below that, there's a gap. And the technology that it takes to stay on top of the ever-changing environment, technology environment, is very difficult for law enforcement. One of the things that we do is we will train folks in cybersecurity and cybercrime investigations, and they'll do a really good job, and we'll promote them and we'll put them in traffic. After we spent, that's what we do. I mean, that's the reality. We'll take and put all these hundreds of thousands of dollars into their training, and you don't want to scale them back from being promoted as a police officer, and so local agencies will promote them, and then we'll put them somewhere else in the agency and not take advantage of their skills. And so we're having to figure out, how are we going to maintain continuity of this investigative capabilities and the technologies that are associated? And in addition to that, how do we keep pace with the ever-changing evolution that's now, I think, evolving about every 14 months, where it used to be 2 years? So that's a big challenge for us.
So, Tor, how does this loop into the CFAA?
In terms of,
Like, why are we talking about the CFFA and cyber physical? Like,
any prosecution under of a cyber kinetic attack is going to be under the CFAA.
Right.
So in terms of like prosecution and then,
Sorry, hold on one second.
in terms of prosecution and then also you're investigating, because any kind of attack could be perpetrated, like say the attacker was living in DC, but the attack was on, say, where you, like your area of jurisdiction there. Wouldn't they all be federal crimes because it's crossing state lines? Like, how does that work?
No, go for it.
Not necessarily. It depends on how the laws are written, and this is something Tor and I were talking about beforehand. I think more the prosecutors and the police officers and the defense attorneys need to get together, and we need to craft better laws. In one of the jurisdictions that I was a chief in down in Georgia, they have laws that say, in some cases, that if you can prove that any part of the violation occurred within your jurisdiction, it can be prosecuted there. And so you can do local prosecutions on a state level in that location, even though the individual may have been in the UK or something like that. Now, whether or not you're going to extradite is another question. You get international, then you're certainly going to be talking about that, depending on the amount of loss. But still, you have that threshold that you have to deal with, whether we're going to do it on the state and our capabilities, whether we can do that.
Thank you.
I just want to follow up on that. I think that's a fascinating issue in computer law, because unlike under the common law, with computers you can traverse multiple jurisdictions at the speed of light. And the problem you have with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and a lot of computer laws is the jurisdictions interpret the law differently, particularly like the CFAA. There's what's called a circuit split among the Federal Court of Appeals on what unauthorized access means. So you could actually be committing a felony in one jurisdiction while what you're doing in the other jurisdiction is completely legal. And there's no clarity on that. And that's, I think, a major issue in computer law. And then on top of that, on the state level, every state, I think, except for two, actually no, Georgia just passed one, so it's only, I think, like one, has some sort of state level analog of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. As a practical matter, the states, when the feds come in, the states usually stand down, but that's not always the case. So that's a really, really complicated issue and a good question.
Now, the most fascinating thing in this area generally is when information crosses borders. So whether it's state borders, and we're talking about federal legislation, when we're talking about international borders, it gets very interesting. We'll talk a little bit about the Cloud Act that was just passed and what that has ramifications of when we're talking about jurisdictional issues. And we'll also talk, I mean, when we think about the GDPR, right? A lot of people are dealing with those kinds of issues, not a security issue or a criminal issue, but a civil data privacy issue. Also the same kinds of jurisdictional issues as to how is this all going to be regulated and who's responsible for what. So those cross-border type issues, very, very interesting generally.
I think it's safe to say that we need to devise laws that are more clear, they're more easy to understand, particularly for the layperson, and particularly for the prosecutors. As much as it pains me, I have to compliment Thor as a defense attorney, as being a police chief, but he's one of the most, and I've just met him here about 20 or 30 minutes ago, and he's the most learned in this area that I've found in a very long time. And when you start talking about prosecutions, it's not just whether the law is there. It's whether you can get an investigator to understand it. It's whether you can get the prosecutor to understand it. And then ultimately, can you get a jury to understand it, or even the judge? And so if we've got such complex laws that even the courts can't decide upon them, you know, the ability to create an environment that is conducive to holding unethical hackers accountable is almost an impossibility. So we got to do a better job at revising our laws.
Somebody, we have one question there, right? Oh, here.
Sorry. Law is not I don't really know much about law, so if I'm asking anything ignorant, please point it out. But this is more of an ethical question, right? Mr. Ekeland mentioned that a lot of these major hacks are are caused by, usually younger children who might be, immature, or perhaps people with low SES might get into hacking because, makes money and they have to get out of the low SES somehow. So if I may ask, it's more of a ethical question, not really a description of the law, but a normative theory of how we ought to devise the laws. Should we make an exception for people with low SES or who might display these immature behaviors?
I can take that, or do you want to? You can start. This is a really interesting area because I think one of the problems with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is that it has cookie cutter penalties, and they're very, very draconian. If the federal government was prosecuting computer crimes in the 70s, like they are now, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Wozniak would have all gone to jail. And you probably wouldn't have Apple Computer, you probably wouldn't have Microsoft. Hackers learn by taking apart systems, by trying to penetrate systems. So there's, I think, a very real argument that what the CFAA does is it sort of criminalizes behavior that's integral to our economy, and finding the right balance between deterring behaviors that we don't want. And I do find a lot of hackers, really, really good hackers, have certain, I don't know the best way to characterize it, mental states that are a little bit different than the general population, but allows them to focus like they do and makes them good at their thing. Finding the balance between the deterrent, the punishment, and also realizing you may be crushing young computer talent that's not necessarily penetrating the system because they're doing anything malicious, but because they're engaged in sort of an intellectual act, or a little minor teenage rebellion does not warrant felony charges with like 5 to 10 years in jail and destroying people's lives. And then you put them in the US prison system. I'm not even gonna talk about that. So I'm gonna leave that alone. Terry?
You want to say?
Well, I was just going to say, like, when we also, when we're talking about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, when we're talking about protected computers and devices, the other area where we see those kinds of issues is with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and digital rights management. So it's the same thing. You could have a tinkerer, right, that's just trying to work on their own car engine, but because it is protected by the DMCA, that might be an unlawful act. And so these kinds of issues are very, very interesting, and it's not just one law, and that's what makes it interesting, at least for, I guess, us as lawyers too, is it's not just one law that regulates how data is managed and what kind of civil and criminal liability is attached to using it or accessing it or collecting it or sharing it. There are overlapping state, federal, and international laws, and so these kinds of issues are impacted in a much, much broader way as well.
And the question is an excellent question. So the thinking that it wasn't an excellent question is really a misnomer. At the end of the day, it's about behaviors, as Tor said. And it's really, the law doesn't give you the ability to truly look at the totality of the circumstances. And what we need to really focus on is the degree of harm that's occurred and what's the past of the individual who committed the violation. And that's where the laws need to be, in my opinion, revised. I mean, when we're talking about putting violent offenders and drug offenders back out on the street, and we're trying to talk about revitalizing them and decriminalizing this and that, but yet we're wanting to put 10 years or 15 years on a kid who literally just goes in to see if he can break a system, there's, one's a violent offender and one's not. I mean, there's something wrong with that. So there needs to be a balancing across the board associated with it. The second thing is I'll take away all the legalese and I'll put it into a practical example. We've got cases where now that we deal with, say, burglaries, and you've got a home, and somebody comes to the home and the door is locked. They kick in the door, they do a lot of damage to break in, or they break in the window. They steal TVs and everything out of there for personal gain. And then you got some kid who walks into a house with the front door standing open, goes, grabs a couple of pieces of candy and walks out. The crime is the same, but the penalties are not the same. We consider those on a broader basis. And that's the same analogy we need to really apply when we're looking at the type of hacks that we're talking about. But we're not doing it.
But the difficulty in that, and this is something that the courts are struggling with on a civil level, I'm sure on a criminal side as well, is what is data worth? Right? And that's a very, very hard question. What is the harm? Absolutely. And it's a very hard issue to understand.
Hi.
Well,
good
and
morning.
at the end of the day, there need to be consequences to illegal actions. But the flip side of that is, how can you create an environment to where a kid can learn and get those skills, tools, and abilities? Is there a legal way that we can do that without having to commit an illegal act? That's the problem that nobody really wants to address.
Suppose you have a situation where the person who does this illegal act is not an American citizen. You have no history on them. You don't really know who they are. Then what do you do? I agree, the child who walks in getting candy is just a child getting candy. Somebody who's in high school or college hacking, okay, they've lived in the neighborhood, they have no background, no criminal background, but now they've come from another country, and we don't know who they are. Now what?
Do you want to address it?
Well, that might be a good segue into discussing active defense, right?
Well, so when we talk about active defense, I want everybody to think about a couple of different things. One is active defense. The other one is violations of terms of use, which can get captured into CFAA types of violations. The other thing I want everybody to think about is bug bounties and what your own personal view is on that, because the law has started addressing bug bounties. And with that, Tor, do you want to start talking about the active defense or some of the newer laws that we're seeing around the CFAA?
Yeah, you've got, right now there's a bill pending, I think, in Congress. It hasn't been passed. I think it's called the Active Computer Defense Act or something, ACDC for short. You Google it. But it basically allows people, computer owners whose systems are being intruded upon, not just a single instance, but repeatedly, to access the computer that they suspect is doing it and take countermeasures. And they won't be held liable under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for unauthorized access, as they would be now for doing that. Or so the sort of the big meta question with that is that a good idea? You've got corporations saying, yes, it's a great idea. We're being hacked by these people in China or Russia or Eastern Europe or people we don't know. We need to be able to take countermeasures and teach them a lesson. And then there's sort of I call it the Stuxnet school of thought of unintended consequences. If you're familiar with Stuxnet, that's the, what would you call it? The malware developed by the US and the Israelis that they put on the Iranian centrifuges to cause them to basically spin and blow up, right? Well, that was just supposed to stay on that centrifuges, but that malware started spreading all over the world. So that's one way people say we can deal with these people we can't reach in these jurisdictions. Whether or not that's the proper approach, I think is open for debate.
And the cameras are not on you, right? So around the room, who thinks active defense is generally a good policy to have? Is this something we want in the law?
When you say active defense, that's hack back.
Hack back.
Right?
That's a good phrase for it.
Well, so who in the room thinks it's a good idea? Who in the room thinks it's a bad idea? It's about even, right?
Well, and sometimes, in retrospect, years from now, we may say it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Right.
So one thing that Tor said, persistent victim. Who knows what a persistent victim is? That's how the legislation is written. So if you're attacked one time, you can't avail yourself of the current law that's pending in Congress. You also have to notify the FBI before you hack back. So that's also part of the law. Who thinks that's a good idea, notifying the FBI before? I mean, there are pros, I mean, you know, right? So no, who thinks it's a bad idea? Nobody, and most people don't want to answer, right? So just for the video.
Here's the issue. Should you be held accountable if your hackback spreads as Tor thought about and it infects somebody else? Should you be accountable for that?
Absolutely.
Criminally or civilly?
It depends on which country. Khizar's a lawyer, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's,
I don't know.
yeah, that's,
Well, to me, it goes back to the degree of harm. Because the idea here is, in a utopian world, is that we're all trying to reduce the degree of harm from these various different attacks. And so if we do, say, a hackback, and then you're eliminating a harm by doing that, that's one thing. But if it spreads, and then all of a sudden you're doing more harm than what the original attack was, that opens up a whole new avenue.
So what's interesting, what's interesting about that bill that's pending right now is it protects you. It protects you from criminal liability. It does not protect you from civil liability. So the CFAA has a civil and a criminal component. So you can still be liable if your hackback causes damages to a third party.
The reason why a lot of people are against the attacking back is you don't know who you're attacking. Yeah, you got some guy attacking you. Well, suppose he's part of a botnet. Could be an independent zombie that doesn't know what the hell's going on, who's attacking you, but they're not really doing an attack on you. Somebody's doing the attack through them. So the thing is, do you really know who you're attacking? The other thing is, there's a difference between attacking somebody within the United States and attacking somebody outside of the United States. If you attack somebody outside of the United States, now you're doing an attack against somebody in another country. And that's, brings in other types of issues with State Department and things like that. And then that's all legal stuff. And then there's the ethical thing about attacking someone else, So just wanted to make those comments.
I like that comment because if I was a certain mindset and they did pass this law, I would probably maybe root someone's server and that I didn't like and launch an attack from that server and then get the corporation to, I would start all sorts of fights if I was a particular mindset and have some fun with this. But hackers don't like pranks, so it's going to work out great. What's next? Any other questions on that? I think it's a
Well, I have a statement. I would be very thankful if I knew that I was being hacked, and I wouldn't do a countermeasure because I don't want them to develop new ideas, philosophies, or software. I'll let them think they're successful. Why should I do a countermeasure and wake them up? I'll let them think they're successful and not help them develop anything else. Now, about attacking back, that's a think tank issue. That's like, what's the situation between us and whatever that country is? But I would never tip my hand and say, I know you're attacking me. I would let them think they're very successful. No, let them steal false data.
Yeah, but then you have to set a hiding pattern.
Oh, what? I'm not saying no. All I'm saying is the minute you tell them by a countermeasure that you have been attacked, you're waking up their developers who'll probably get a nice new house as a result of developing new, so they're going to work hard. They're compensated very well. You wake them up by doing this countermeasure. So I'd be very circumspect. I would complain and put news out, and that's it.
One thing we can all agree on, right, probably in this room, is there's no one size fits all in this area. Right? I mean, that would be part of a larger policy discussion by the company or anything, whether it makes sense at that time to actually do that or not.
We just have 1 minute. And would you like to have some closing
We only have
thoughts?
1 minute. Oh, please.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh, we have 1 more minute to go, or 1 minute before the Q&A? Okay, so first off, the only thing I'll say is make sure next time people write in to say this should be longer. All right?
I'm around after this if you want to talk more about this. I think this is fascinating issues. I don't think there's any clear answers to any of this stuff. And if I had to say one thing about computer law is the pace of development of technology has far outstripped the pace of the law, which changes very, very slowly. And I think that's normally a good thing about the law. But I think when it comes to computers and the laws, it's a disaster.
Ditto. what he said. You know, I do think that the laws have to evolve, and we need to get a bunch of bright people in a room, and we need to think about laws that are flexible, that are written clearly, concisely, but broad enough to capture the new technologies that come on board. And that's easy to say, not easy to do.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.